Hello, everyone. My name is Tony Thompson, and on behalf of SS8, I'd like to thank you for joining this webinar on the future of incident response. I'm excited to be joined by Mike Rothman, president of leading information security research and advisory firm Securosis, which really prides itself on transparency, objectivity, and quality. Thanks for joining us today, Mike.
Thank you, Tony. Great to be here. Really excited.
Yeah, so also joining us for the discussion is SS8's own Faizel Lakhani, who is president and COO of SS8. Mike and Faizel have actually worked together on various projects over the years, so this should turn out to be a great discussion. But before we jump into the topic on the future of incident response, I'd like to quickly cover a couple of housekeeping items. In your viewer, you're going to see some widgets that you can use to interact with us, trying to keep this in interactive format. The questions widget will allow you to submit questions at any time throughout the webinar. And in the interest of keeping this an interactive discussion, and maybe unlike some other webinar formats, I'm going to do my best to field any questions as they come in, and we'll insert them into the conversation. We'll also cover some of the Q&A at the end as well. A replay of the event is going to be available within about an hour after the conclusion of this live event. And we've also included, or will be including, a copy of the presentation and a great white paper that Mike's actually written on the topic of incident response. And of course, you can always find this event and other resources on the website of ss8.com. So with that, let's go ahead and get started, Mike.
Thank you, Tony. Appreciate that. Oh, God, who is that dashing-looking guy? It must be Faizel. So, no. So first, let me give a little bit of a brief intro in terms of Securosis and what it is that we do. We're independent analysts. All we focus on is security. We're passionate about what it is that we do. We're all been practitioners and, kind of knee-deep in a lot of this stuff. And really, again, I can't highlight it enough. It really is a passion of ours in terms of, helping organizations understand how to protect themselves and really how to deal with a lot of the evolution that we see from both a technology and a security standpoint. But first, you need to know a little bit about how I spend my day. So my day is largely split amongst talking to people who are certainly a lot smarter than me and spending a bunch of time on the meme generator. If you're not familiar with the meme generator, you should be. See, we put the pontiff in pontification, and I can spend a whole mess of time looking for cool images on Flickr, which you'll see throughout my portion of the presentation, as well as a whole bunch of time thinking up pithy quotes on the meme generator. So without further ado, let's really kind of jump in to understanding kind of the whole security landscape. And I've been doing it as Faizel has and Tony has. We've been in this space for a long time. And for a long time, and hold on one sec, excuse me. For a long time, and by a long time I can, certainly say 2013, and obviously before then, a lot of security folks spent most of their time and a lot of their budget on, a big category, a classification that I'll call stuff that doesn't work. And we can throw a whole bunch of different technologies, you name it, it's probably in there. And we spent, again, millions, probably billions of dollars trying to solve a lot of these issues. So what we did here is put together basically a chart of made-up numbers that show at some point in the future, maybe it's 2020, maybe it's earlier, maybe it's later, we get to the point where detection and response actually surpasses the stuff that doesn't work. And that's absolutely critical to really understand, is that what we've seen is a shift. And again, whether it's 20%, whether it's 40%, the numbers really don't matter from that perspective. What we want to point out here is that what we've seen is a shift in terms of both buyer dynamics as well as effectiveness relative to spending less money on, I'll call them preventative, protective type of controls, and more money on detection and response, because we know there are some classes of adversaries that we absolutely cannot stop. So we better get a lot better at detecting and making the point here, no matter what we're spending on prevention, no matter what we're spending on detection, it's not enough, because basically we can't win, right? And that's one of the things that I think is important for security folks to truly understand and to get past, is this concept that you can actually win at security, right? It's not about winning. It's really about kind of surviving, right? There's always someone better than you. They've got more money. They're funded. They've got more time. Certainly in the United States, we're certainly seeing the impact of ongoing, cyber attacks and leaks almost on a daily basis. So what we have is a situation where it's really about trying to figure out what's happening in our environment as quickly as we can if there are adversaries in our environment or when there are adversaries in our environment, detecting that as quickly as possible and understanding how I'm going to deal with that, and then obviously going through a pretty regimented process to handle the incident, to respond to the incident, to make sure that I'm remediating those problems and eventually cleaning up the mess.
Hey, and Mike, that's an interesting point, right? With the challenge of money and time and the human element in there, is there a play here for sort of the managed detection and response capability that could come into play? What do you think about that?
You are absolutely hired as my straight person, right? Set me up for the next point. But that really is a great point relative to the fact that we are all dealing not just with adversaries that are in many cases more talented and certainly better funded and absolutely more patient than we can be. We're dealing with a very acute skills gap where we just don't have the resources in order to do all the investigations, in order to really understand what a lot of these attacks are doing, in order to really get a handle on what the right workaround should be for those specific attacks that we're facing. So, again, one of the points I'm making here is that people are absolutely the constraint. And of course it would be, and I told you I spent a lot of time on Flickr looking for cool images, right? Must be able to pass the drug test and work weekends. And I think the weekends part of it's probably a little bit more important than a drug test if you're talking about a security practitioner, because the attackers don't seem to attack at convenient time frames. But really, when you think about kind of managed services, when you think about outsourcers or external forensicators, as we call them, that do have a specific skill set, I do think there's a very important role for those kinds of offerings, again, to supplement the internal team, because we just don't have the resources that we need in order to solve the problem.
Yes, and Mike, just to add a little, this is Faizel. I think the number one problem in the security space is you can't hire a cyber investigator if your life depended on it. And so then the problem with security vendors is our tools are so complicated and complex, the workflows in the detect and respond are so hard that as a result the bar becomes so high that you just cannot hire those people, and the people that are really good, they go to the highest paying opportunities. And I think that as a vendor and as people who supply solutions, that's the number one priority, which is make it so that it's damn easier to use.
Faizel, that's a great point. And one of the things that we say about kind of the next generation of technology that really is going to enable better and more effective use of security controls, and obviously incident response is a key part of that, is to make, I don't want to be mean, right, but make folks that could be deemed as mediocre or not experienced or, certainly not ninjas, and make them more productive, right? Make them, and the only way to do that is really through technology, because they're not going to get the experience. That only happens with time. So what we need to do is invest in a new generation of tools that can make these less experienced practitioners a lot more effective at what they do. So then there's the cloud, right? So I'll just drop this picture here and leave it, drop the mic for a few minutes, let you kind of contemplate and really think about the impact of cloud. But again, I think just like Faizel and Tony, we've all been in this space for a long time, and I'll only speak for myself, but I've certainly never seen anything that promises to be as disruptive as the cloud, right? So we're seeing organizations really kind of blow up the way they provision technology, the way they develop technology, the way they introduce technology to their customers, the way they derive value from a lot of these investments, the ability to move a lot faster, the ability to really deploy technology continuously. It really is changing a lot of the way that technology works. A lot of the existing structures that have been built over 15 or 20 years are being upended as we see it right in front of our eyes. And it really is one of the, again, most incredible things that I've seen in my, multi-decade, working career. And obviously that has an impact across the entire food chain, right? Not just how we deploy and buy servers or don't buy servers, right? Not just how we roll out technology or don't roll out technology, not how we build our technology stack, certainly not how we protect things. Right. One of the things that I think cloud security impacts is how it is that we have to protect our environment, what we have, and what we'll talk about, some of the issues that we have with the cloud as we move forward in the presentation. But again, I'd love to get your guys' feedback on that as well. But this is a trend where it's like I certainly know a number of practitioners that have their head firmly in the sand about the fact that the cloud is going to go away and it's just a passing fancy. But from where we sit, we think this is one of those trends that promises to leave almost nothing untouched within a couple of years. Thoughts, guys? Or I've stunned you into silence? I mean, cloud impacting what you guys are doing?
No, absolutely. I mean, we look at the cloud and say there's a huge implication to that. Number one, in terms of delivery of solutions, because back in the days when we used to deploy stuff on customer prem, everybody knows the biggest problem was how the hell do you deploy it, configure it, set it up. The cloud has really helped us make the deployment part so easy. The second thing, though, is all the apps have gone to the cloud, and not all, but they're on a transitionary road. And as that occurs, the visibility of what's happening becomes more and more difficult to see. And so now you got to be able to have solutions that just can't protect the traditional hard perimeter, but need to be able to see and understand not just the soft perimeter, but where that soft perimeter goes into the cloud, be able to see there. And that's huge. And the traditional security goes through these life cycles, and the traditional security vendors, they're still saying, I can stop all bad things. And the reality is you can't, and you have to have visibility in order to uncover that and detect and respond. Totally.
You bet. You bet. So when we'll get, I want to talk a little bit more about visibility because it's important. But the first thing that we certainly wanted to highlight was this idea of governance. Right. And when you think about, kind of what you need in order to do incident response, it's actually kind of important that who owns what, who's responsible for what are my, handoffs, who's accountable to do certain aspects of the response process. And one of the things, again, more from a procedural and a process standpoint, when you think about incidents and managing the incidents, is to make sure that a lot of this stuff is defined ahead of time. So making sure that you understand where your data actually is. And depending on the architecture of what you're doing, and, Faizel, I think you were talking a little bit about SaaS. We're certainly having, a number of customers that are, and clients that are, rolling production activities into both public clouds and leveraging platform as a service types of offerings as a core feature and function of those technology stacks. So understanding where your data is kind of important. And when you start thinking about jurisdiction, and we mentioned, and I think we'll talk a little bit about encryption later on in the talk. You just have and especially monitoring, right? That's one of the big things that SS8 brings to the table. Understanding where this data is and understanding how the jurisdictional aspects of that become important as you are really focusing on this. So again, as we move traditional incident response to encompass not just my existing data center, but also a bunch of data that could be in SaaS environments or potentially in public clouds or even hybrid clouds, understanding where the data is, who's responsible for it, and ultimately what the jurisdictional responsibilities are is absolutely critical.
Yeah, and I think the big issue there is the word incident response, right? So when I hear that word, a lot of people say, oh, I know something bad has happened, and I just need to jump on it and figure out what the heck to do. And I go, well, nowadays it's different. It's suspicion, and like you said, detect and respond. Not everything that you see that you're investigating needs to go somewhere. but you need to have a way to be able to look as much of that as possible. And then, in addition to that, it's this question that says, where is the data and all of that? So I go, one of the problems today that we learned with Yahoo is you go, they got breached. Verizon's probably going to go back, I don't know, I'm not an insider, and say, hey, I think the company's worth less, and they're probably going to lose money on that side. And part of the struggle is where this has been going on for a long period. How come there wasn't tools and infrastructure in place to help them? I think these are questions that are causing an explosion in the area of incident response and incident response tools and tool chain to help people move to a detect and response model.
Yeah, you bet. So another aspect of that is diligence when you start looking at potential deals or partnerships or what have you. And obviously, you'll get a certain amount of access to a potential target's environment. But those are key questions to ask because you really need to understand the security posture of anybody that you're ultimately negotiating with. So with that, let's hit on really the next thing, and Faizel did, kind of allude to this, and that's obviously the differences in visibility as you move towards infrastructure that you don't necessarily control. So that's one of these areas where you really have to think more strategically about how you're going to monitor your environment. What are the right touch points to really start to gather some of the telemetry that you need to do the analysis and the analytics that are required to really understand what's happened and get down to responding to these specific incidents. So, understand that in the cloud, you don't have access to the packets. So you have to figure out a different way to, get the telemetry that you need out of the network. You can't see into platform as a service. You see what the SaaS vendors want you to see. So in a lot of cases, that's activity logs and maybe some change logs, but you're not really going to get a lot of in-depth application activity. You can route cloud traffic through inspection points, but that does have an impact on the way traffic routes through the cloud. And in some cases, it can break it. It certainly may not be as efficient. So again, when you're thinking about how you're going to evolve your incident response function to factor in all these different kinds of services that you can use, again, remember, how am I going to get this information? How am I going to look at the network aspect of this becomes absolutely one of these things that, again, you have to factor in because it is a fundamental change relative to what it is that we're used to.
And so when you talk about PaaS and SaaS and you talk about these cloud applications, right, encryption must come into play here. So is that affecting the ability to detect and respond or actually conduct a thorough investigation as part of IR?
It absolutely is. I mean, I think that what you have is, and listen, I mean, decryption is not brain surgery, right? SSL is not brain surgery, but doing it at scale kind of is. And networks continue to get faster, applications and the amount of compute requirements continue to increase. So keeping pace and scaling up the ability to inspect network traffic continues to be a problem.
Right. And another thing
so we see a lot of organizations looking at, I don't call them offload boxes, but certainly making sure that any monitoring system that they have can keep pace with the amount of encrypted traffic within their network.
Yeah, and let me just add something to that. So, I mean, I think today as encryption has become a consumerized item and it's standard and ubiquitous across the board, we see, nowadays it's kind of like, do I break it or not? And we actually, I look at it and say, philosophically, I'm like going, I don't know that you have to break it. I think rather than that, what you have to do is be able to understand what it is, where it is, and how it's going, and what's the behavior of the encrypted application, which then allows you to do a ton of stuff to realize, wait, is that the secrets of Yahoo leaving over, hours and days and months and years? Or is that just a guy logging into his Bank of America portal? And I think it's that understanding that
helps with the encryption problem that doesn't require you to have ubiquitous encryption either. But that's something we can talk about.
Yeah, and I do want to kind of dig into that a little bit when we get more into the more free-flowing discussion aspect, because that is something that is plaguing a lot of organizations relative to how they're planning out their environment. So just to wrap up my piece of it, this is your life if you decide to do things in IR. So what we have here is, of course, Socrates, basically saying he'll take the hemlock as opposed to the job in IR, or, you can use whatever metaphor you want, the hamster wheel, certainly abusing Duff beer. If you're a Simpsons fan, you'll get that. But, the fact of the matter is it's not it's a tough gig. Right? Incident response is a tough gig, and it's getting harder due to the sophistication of the adversaries, due to the lack, and we talked about the lack of skills that are available there, due to the fact that I think the tools are still largely focused towards much more highly sophisticated practitioners, and it all kind of combines into making things pretty difficult for responders. So the reality is there is a way forward, and with that, I'll let Faizel run through a couple of different ideas, and then I'll be poking in and out as you talk, bud. Hopefully, I won't interrupt you too much.
No, that's fine. So I start by saying that the key missing link in the past has been this idea that says in security, every day you get smarter, whether it's learning about new threats, learning about new things. And as that smartness occurs, all of the preventative solutions sit there and say, okay, I'm going to take that smartness and I'm going to prevent it if it happens again. And in today's world, the attacks have become so narrow, they've become so focused that idea no longer provides the protection that it used to. And in order to fix that, the key is to be able to take intelligence and ideas and be able to apply them against historical views of what's happening. So when you look at, the SS8 approach, we look at this and say, there's constantly discovery of new threats. There's constantly a view that says, hey, there's a command and control. Hey, there's a way in which people are exfiltrating. Hey, there's this going on. There's that going on. And when you uncover those things, the problem becomes is how the heck do you wind the clock back to figure this out? And that's really what we focused on from the incident response perspective, is to say incident responders are getting pounded with threat intelligence information, other alerts coming from security devices, and what they lack is an ability to say, should I care or not? Do I waste my time or not? And that's kind of what we've been focused around. And when you look at that problem of do I spend time or not, it comes down to a couple of components. And, there's so many security vendors that if you bought one of everything, every company would probably spend a couple $100 million on security. The reality is security comes down to a couple of things. First, is it easy to use? Can you sit there and click 4 buttons and go click, click, oh, real, do something, or click, click, this is not real, move on. And so what we've done is really taken our history empowering 6 of the world's largest intelligence agencies and, large law enforcement communities, and taken the expertise from getting a beat cop to being able to look at data and turning that into an enterprise security tool. Again, lowering the bar. The second thing is that you can't look for things that you don't have good data on. And so we focus on how do you get the best possible summarization of the network that allows you to then be able to draw conclusions. And I kind of akin it to say, if you look at a picture and you're looking down from 10,000 feet, you'll see a whole bunch of buildings and a whole bunch of roads. But if you're really going to map your course from one point to another, you really got to come down a level. And this is what these HDRs really do, is we generate network summaries of what's happening, and I'll explain why summaries. But once you have those summaries, they become the cold notes of kind of what has happened and how it happened in a very simplified, rich way. The next thing that we argue is to say, well, the next problem in security is how much does it cost? And the cost equation is if I'm the biggest bank in the world, I've got lots of money and budget's not a thing to constrain me. The reality is everybody has a budget issue. And in our case, we say, well, how you solve this problem is either you store a ton of packets. That sounds expensive. On a gig network, that's like a massive amount. On a gigabit network, 2 weeks of data, we can store 8 years of history in the same data footprint of 2 weeks of data, which allows us to drastically cut the cost equation down significantly. And the last issue is, history is not just something that you do in IR. It's not just, hey, how do I investigate? But history is something that that actually highlights things that happen in IR. So as an example, people talk about these ideas called, hey, somebody got on my network and they beaconed. What's a beacon? And few people talk about it, but this is normal HTTP, TCP traffic that actually looks completely normal, which is why next-gen firewalls, they don't see them. The reality is the only way to truly catch a beacon, if you don't know the IP address where it's beaconing, is to actually do a very complex time sequence analysis on history. And this is where, what we've done at SS8, powering, intelligence agencies and helping, uncover terrorists and things like that, it's been always about the unknown unknown. And bringing in this, and we've been doing this for 15 years, this idea of time machines for history, is to say, hey, I just learned that there's a potential terrorist plot to blow up the New York Bridge. Man, how do I go back and figure that out? And it's that learning analytics that we have built into the system. And from that perspective, be able to help in terms of incident response. So I'm going to stop there. And, Mike, I don't know if you have some comments to make or... Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead, Mike.
No, I was going to actually want, kind of ask Faizel for you to expand a little bit on, obviously packets are expensive, right? I get that. Hard to scale up, obviously hard to move around, once you capture them. Doing analytics can be challenging. But when you go more towards a metadata approach, what aren't you getting that you can get with the package, right? There's got to be some compromises one way or the other.
Absolutely. And one of the biggest compromises is if you think back to the days when, we were in the business of getting a signature of a file. And we were in the business of figuring out what was the executable so we could run it through our sandbox. And packets are the only way to do that. If you need to build a signature of a file or you need to cause the executable to explode inside of a sandbox, you can't do that with high-definition records. The high-definition record will tell you there was a file that looked like this. Here's the MD5. Here's the first 200 bytes. But it won't tell you what's inside. Packets are the only way. But what packets obviously won't do is you can't economically store them. You can't analyze them. You can't run analytics over packets. And maybe you can't today. Maybe 20 years from now, somebody will be able to build some really good analytics around that. But that's what you don't get with packet recording. Or you do get with packet recording, and why people still need that. But the metadata gives you, the HDRs give you a far broader remit.
You bet. And I think one of the architectural constructs that we always advocated, when thinking about packets is really, capturing very limited views of the infrastructure, right? Maybe right in front of an important database or, kind of coming off of your perimeter, and then using more effective means across the rest of the network because it just was too expensive.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, Mike, when Faizel talked about this learning component, how do you see the idea of machine learning, kind of buzzword du jour, right? Artificial intelligence. How do you see that playing a role in overcoming? You mentioned the human element earlier of incident response. You think that's going to play a role and be a significant role?
I do. It's entertaining for me, for folks to all of a sudden believe that math is the way that, we're going to solve all these problems. At least as far as I know, we've had math for a little while. I made a little joke about, kind of Socrates, that I can bust out my Galileo or my Newton at any given time and rely back on math. But kidding aside, I do think that, kind of some of the new data reduction technology, some of the ways that we can isolate patterns in a multivariate, multifaceted, data set, it does give us clues relative to finding attack patterns that were difficult to find otherwise. So I do think that there is a pretty significant impact to, doing better analytics on the data that we have. But again, I think you still largely need to know what you're looking for, and having somebody to mine through what you found continues to be pretty important.
Right. So actually, to add on that, and I'd agree with you on the math side. We've always had it. What's different now is we're applying it at a different scale, but that doesn't necessarily mean all of a sudden we're going to uncover magical, pixie dust as a result of it. What I will say is that when you apply data science against very, very good, high-quality data, now you can uncover things that, has far more meaning. Let me give an example. When you analyze information at an aggregate, we're all technicians, so we sit here and say, well, if I look at net flow and I analyze stuff that's going from IP address to IP address on ports, when you analyze that, you'll get a set of summaries that'll come out that will be useful, but will be bound to that layer 3, layer 4 information. Now, when I pull it up a level and say, now I'm going to actually apply the same analytics, but now I'm going to apply them to things like, hey, that was a Dropbox session. That certificate was signed by Google. That certificate was signed by Facebook. Hey, that was actually Faizel's MacBook, and it sent a UDP packet that looked like this. And as I get more granular, the analytics will result in far better results because I'm being really, really precise on the application of it. But I think this is a fascinating area that, machine learning specifically, that when applied with the right fidelity can result in great things.
Yeah, totally agree. And one of the misnomers I think that, we kind of have to get over is who's supposed to be doing the data science, right? Is a customer expected to start hiring a whole mess of data science? Well, crap, we can't find responders, right? We can hardly even find SOC analysts. Where the hell are we going to find, data scientists that are really experienced doing, these kinds of security analytics? So, I think that the additional math gives us the ability to have very specialized data scientists that can find and isolate a bunch of these patterns that then we can look back through our historical data and look for these patterns as they may be.
Yeah, absolutely. So, another question here that's come in is this idea of network versus endpoint. And, where do you think it's better to do my detection and response, or do these get split up? Yeah, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, the endpoint is very shiny right now, right? Everybody wants to be on the endpoint. Ooh, EDR, and, lots of other, fancy acronyms for pulling telemetry out of an endpoint. And to be clear, I think that there are certainly a lot of use cases where endpoint telemetry is helpful, especially when you start thinking about the internals of how malicious code is compromising devices, what's actually being stolen. There is certainly an aspect of confirmation that I think endpoint telemetry does provide relative to what you're seeing. But I grew up as a network guy. I've always been a network guy, so I still kind of rely and default back to the network because it's really hard to game a full network, right? You can mess with endpoint logs, you can eliminate them, you can resequence them. It's really hard to, kind of game the network. So I think the answer is not, they're not mutually exclusive. I don't think it's an either or type of thing, but I do continue to harp on the importance of focusing on network telemetry as a key aspect of this, because again, it's hard to make it lie. And ultimately, any kind of breach is going to involve some type of network access. So, you will get signs when you think about it when you're monitoring your network effectively.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think from our perspective, we've seen areas where you look at the network as that's more of your detection, use it for investigations, and then when it comes to the remediation component, you're looking more to an endpoint tool. So I think we'd agree. We'd see, certainly applicability in that case. So we've got a couple of questions here that have come in from the audience, Mike, and I think these are in particular probably for you. One is with how we are advancing our cloud capabilities every day. Where do you see from a federal level the requirements or incident response and requirements going from where they are now?
That's actually a great question. So, I think that one of the things to really think about is there are very specific FedRAMP requirements for how cloud networks have to and must be in order to support any kind of U.S. federal activity. But what we haven't seen is whether NIST or any of the other folks that have produced some information or documentation about how incident response formally has to happen, how that's going to evolve, again, when you don't have the visibility over the network. That's one of the holes that we don't see filled quite yet. So I can tell you, obviously, it's different. As we talked about, governance is different, as well as the lack of visibility is different. What that really means from specifically the U.S. federal aspect, I don't think any of us know quite yet.
Right. Yeah, makes sense. Got another question here from the audience, which is, how are you able to overcome detecting malware that encrypts data that is being exfiltrated? This looks like this is for us more so. And the answer here is that, even though the data is encrypted, our high-definition record capability and the ability to look at the metadata, if you will, we get a lot of information about the traffic, about the communications. And if you look at the world today in the area of hunting for terrorists and hunting for suspects of interest, increasingly the bad guys are encrypting the communications, right? They're using encrypted communications to hide the activity, and that's directly applicable to how we hunt down and investigate devices of interest within an enterprise. And so from that perspective, we're able to use our technology to look at a great level of application information. Did the certificate match the signing authority? We can look at a lot of behavioral things that are happening with the communication. Even though the actual traffic is encrypted, we see a lot of detail about does it line up? Does it match? Is it what we should be expecting to see? And from that, we can decipher that this may be anomalous traffic, or that may be malicious activity that's happening, and it's going perhaps to a destination where it shouldn't be going, or it's GOGGLE, not GOOGLE if you're looking to go to a Google site or something to that effect. So a lot of detail, a lot of level of expertise that we're bringing to the table there.
Yeah, you bet. So one of the things that I would add is, again, Faizel being an old school DLP guy in your background, there actually was some issues in terms of both scale and accuracy relative to actually detecting specific content pieces. So this idea of doing analysis on, kind of patterns as well as destinations and geos and a bunch of these other things can yield very similar types of information as if you could look at the payload.
Yep, absolutely. So this has been really great. We're actually no more questions from the audience at this point. I want to be sensitive to everyone's time as well. Like to keep our content, brief and to the point. And Mike, this has been really great. And I hope the audience has really enjoyed the discussion. If anyone didn't get their questions answered or felt too shy or whatever to ask the question, we can certainly follow up with you if you want to send an email to info@ss8.com. And on behalf of SS8 and Securosis and Mike, I'd like to thank everyone for attending. The on-demand version of this will be available within about an hour. We're also going to be uploading a copy of the presentation within BrightTalk, within the console. It'll also be available on ss8.com. And then, of course, if you need more information about Mike's work in Securosis, you can go to securosis.com. or you can go to ss8.com to get more information about SS8 and what we're doing in the area of breach detection and our time machine model. And with that, I'd like to thank everybody again for attending, and hope everyone has a wonderful rest of their day.
You bet. Take care, guys.